Hi, well, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin for CIMA E2 for November 2014. And in this particular screencast, I'm going to look at Porter's diamond very briefly. Quite a popular little topic. I mean, it comes up. I'd certainly expect if I was a student to score well on it, because obviously we have a framework which hopefully we've learned well and we can just apply that. So this is the type of question that 10 out of 10 I think is possible. In terms of the requirements, really, they simply say, discuss the determinants. They mention the idea of building on competitive advantage or sort of national competitive advantage. So scenario not overly helpful to us, but certainly the answer is quite a comprehensive one. So good short little intro here, just regurgitation really of what's in the requirement, what's in the question. They talk about the interacting determinants and how a knowledge of those can help an individual company become more competitive in the international market. You'll note that they do list the 4 factors before they actually come to detail them in turn also. So little intro there it helps. They perhaps could have mentioned perhaps an example, perhaps the German car industry or IT and in China or perhaps even Silicon Valley. In terms of detail here of each of the 4 factors, quite a lot of good information. Just take them one by one. First area is this idea of factor conditions. And just one point here, do try and learn these terms off well. I've seen quite regularly students getting confused between different models in E2, Porter's 5 forces versus Porter's diamond versus Porter's value chain, etc., etc. So try and make sure you get the terminology correct. That's one thing the marker is obviously going to be looking for. Get it exact. Okay, so factor conditions, we're referring to factors of production or stocks of factors of production. And the type of things that we'd be referring to there are really resources, know-how, capital, etc. So really what we're saying is that certain countries will have a sort of an edge over other countries in relation to these factors of production. And essentially we're talking about the efficiency at which these factors of production are employed, not just simply, as they mention here, the abundance of the factors. So that's a key point to mention under this factor conditions heading. It's efficiency, not just the fact that you have a lot of them. Okay. One other point that we could make here is this split between the 2 areas of factors: basic, basic perhaps raw materials or human resources; advanced, certainly things like skills and indeed know-how and technical ability. So the key point really is that basic factors are all well and good, but we're not going to sustain competitive advantage based on those, but we would based on these more advanced factors, for example, know-how. Okay. Next point, this idea of demand. A couple of key buzzwords in here, and really the main one that I tend to remember is this idea of a sophisticated market. So let's be clear, we're not talking about just a massive demand or a large demand, although obviously that's helpful. We're really talking about the degree to which the home country learns from its customer, and the more sophisticated and indeed demanding the customer is, or the higher the expectations are, that's going to drive innovation and quality, and that's going to help improve the industry generally within the country, and probably give a platform perhaps for overseas expansion, as with perhaps the German car industry. Okay. Second point here, obviously economies of scale are important, but as mentioned again, it's not just the quantity, it's the information that the individual companies learn about their product and or their service perhaps from the consumer. So those are the key points under that issue of demand. Don't make the mistake of just simply saying, oh, well, if there's a big demand, that's great for the company and great for the industry. It isn't necessarily. Okay. Related and supporting industries, quite an easy one to remember. A key word there really is clusters. Really this idea of clusters of linked industries that are combined together in a sort of a mutually supportive sense to really drive competitive advantage. So again, with the German car industry, we've discussed that in detail in classes, and this idea of very, very similar industries, perhaps to the aircraft or airplane industry, really combining together around about 100, 110 years ago to really drive the development of the German car industry, and hence we have so many excellent or premium brands within Germany. So these clusters are important. The more the better. They do split them between vertical and horizontal. No need for that necessarily, but something you could do if you can remember. Okay. Interesting point here in terms of the clusters. They say that obviously a domestic supplier is going to be preferable to a foreign supplier for obvious reasons, proximity in terms of information flows and perhaps even people flows. Okay, so that's the bones of related and supporting industries. Try and mention clusters, mutual support, etc. Last one, probably one of the more difficult ones for students: strategy, structure, and rivalry. And really, what we're saying there is that certain firms or certain industries more culturally suited to particular practices or normal management practices. Perhaps things like sort of funding needs, perhaps the availability of capital for the German car industry going back some years may have lent itself towards small sort of fledgling firms in the car industry or in any sort of growth industry, and as a result of that access to capital, which perhaps was different from another country, it may well be that assisted the German car industry to develop. The rivalry issue there, fairly straightforward. Obviously, the more the rivalry, the better it is in terms of driving innovation and forcing costs down and forcing companies to compete against each other. Okay, there's our favorite phrase there in E2, and indeed all of these string this idea of competitive advantage, and in this case obviously we're talking about global competitive advantage. So in essence, as a summary there on Porter's diamond, let's learn each of the factors. Let's get the terminology right. Quick intro in terms of, the competitive advantage of nations. That was Porter's thesis on this. Each of the 4 points has some key buzzwords. Hopefully you remember some of those. And obviously don't forget just 2 additional points that I would have mentioned in classes from time to time that Porter does suggest may be important outside the 4, and that's a government intervention, or indeed lack of it, and perhaps in the form of a subsidy or a tax break of some kind. And then over and above that, just literally chance events. So, your E2 examiner, I expect, won't be thinking that an E2 student would mention those 2 other points. Try and mention those 2. So in effect, we've got 6 there rather than 4. Okay, hope that's been helpful, and good luck with your studies.